Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I'm really excited to welcome Kyle Rushton, who is a relationship coach and speaker supporting individuals and couples in creating healthy, purposeful, and empowering relationships. He also supports his clients by empowering them to take radical responsibility for the part their world plays by helping them alchemize the healing power of doing inner self-work. And then by opening them up to the transformational potential that their relationship naturally invites in. Then he's able to help them bridge the gap between what they fear and the profound love and connection they desire. He is also the co-host of a men's personal development podcast called Modern Masculinity with a K, which focuses on unpacking topics surrounding the concept of masculinity to help men redefine and realign themselves on what it means to be a modern man. In this episode, Kyle shares his own journey of navigating relationships and what he has learned. Kyle and I then talk about the importance of building a solid foundation on which the relationship can be based on and why it is important to work on ourselves to improve how we show up in our relationships. We discuss many things, including attachment styles, conflict resolution, expressing our insecurities, and timing of communication. If you want to check out Kyle, he's on Instagram at the relationship coach _. And if at the end, if you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. All right, Kyle, thanks for coming to the Easy Conversations podcast and having this conversation with me. We've been chatting offline quite a bit, and you're based in Calgary, so it's always great to have local people come on the podcast. But yeah, I'm really excited for our conversation today. But before we jump into it, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, maybe explain to the listeners what it is that you do, and then let's jam out from there.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation about relationships with you and dive deep into what it means to be in one and in a healthy, meaningful, strong, and powerful relationship. So for those that don't know, my name is Kyle. I more often go by Coach Kyle, and that's because I am a relationship coach and I support people in creating and building meaningful relationships. I help them alchemize the power of the two entities that they are, the two powerhouses that they are, into creating something absolutely extraordinary. And we do that by building it all up from the ground. And essentially, the way I like to look at it is really focusing on the architecture of what the relationship is and where the resources are found and, what the architecture of the foundation really is, because that's where it's all really going to show and prove in the long run what it is that you two are building together and how sturdy and strong your, I call it love tower, really is. So that's my main premise. And then I am also a co-host of the podcast called Modern Masculinity, which is similar to this podcast where it's focused on mental health and men's personal development to engage in hopefully breaking some of the stigmas and traditional roles that we as men feel and breaking into new, healthier, and just more meaningful lifestyles. So that's a bit about what I do and who I am.
Cool. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all that. And very similar, I guess, ideas around, to your point, breaking that stigma. And obviously relationships are huge when it comes to that. A lot of men struggle bringing their true self to the relationships. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a bit. But before we go there, I just want to understand, because that's one of the questions I have, is why relationships? What made you want to focus on that area? If you don't mind sharing.
Absolutely. So I have a pretty deep history and experience with relationships, and I feel like a lot of people can speak to that as well. But I have been in, we'll call it the relational game, for what feels like since the time I was born until this moment. And it's been an intense journey. I remember my very first kiss was in grade 5, and I was seeking that out at that young age. I think you were 10, 11 at that age. Like, you're just such a young little boy. And I was like, yes, like I'm going to be the first one out of everybody to kiss somebody in front of other people. And I don't know if anybody had similar stories, but it's like the gathering they have in schools where they're just almost waiting to watch the little ones kiss. Like, it's so weird, but it's just what happened. And that sent me on the journey towards wanting to be in a relationship and be with somebody and have a partner and at that point, just have a girlfriend. Like it was just have a girlfriend. So that was my journey right out of the gate. And that continued on for, the rest of my life until now. It was a constant in and out of relationship. Some of them lasted long, about 7 years was the longest one, but there was 2 big breaks in between. And I was dating in between those breaks too. So again, it was just this tumultuous relationship with relationships. And it kind of extended into starting out as a life coach because I was fearful of entering into the arena of relationships because it required me to be incredibly vulnerable about my own. And I have found it very common amongst my clients and the people I speak to of speaking about their relationship in a true and honest way, because it feels like you are just supposed to know how to do it.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to be really good at it. And if it ends, then there's something wrong with you. So entering it into that arena felt more vulnerable than just doing on a general life coaching scale. So I avoided it for years in my first initial steps into life coaching. And I always knew it was on my heart. I always knew it was there, but I refused to look at it. It was part of the conversation, obviously, with life coaching because it's part of life.
Yeah.
But I couldn't look at it and as an intense matter as I wanted to or needed to. And then it really came off the back of a pretty harsh, in my experience, a pretty difficult breakup that led me into men's work and then led me into the podcast. And all of a sudden, I realized that a lot of my tendencies surrounded relationships, a lot of my experiences, and also a lot of the conversations I was supporting my clients with was about relationships. It just seemed to be the centerfold. And I said, there's something missing here that's not, in a sense, and this is going to sound maybe a little selfish, but not revitalizing you in these experiences.
Yeah.
Right. Like my service to others is leaving me more depleted than energized. And I'm helping people change their lives, but it's not feeling like I'm doing so. And it came down to, for me, the realization that it was because the relationship side of thing was really where it all stemmed from. And that's why I always phrase it. And there's 3 components to a relationship. There's relationship to self, there's relationship to your partner, and then there's relationship to the world. What does that look like? And you can even break it down in context of what's the relationship to this book that's sitting on my table. Like I have a relationship with this book. I either hate it or I don't. I enjoy writing in it. I think it's beautiful or I think it's ugly. Like there's a relationship, and how I treat it is based on that relationship I see. So I just realized everything was part of that container. So let's just dive head first. Let's get into it and let's really deep dive into my own experience, start to own it. And as I did, I became more alive. So that was the telling experience for me that this is exactly where you should be.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thanks for breaking that down. And I love the way, you've explained it, the 3 relationships. And I think personally, I believe the one that gets undermined or doesn't get any attention in most cases is the one we have with ourselves. And I try to talk about that quite a bit too, is that's where it starts, right? When you were talking about foundations, like that's where it should start. At least in my mind. And then that's where you can, if you've got that strong foundation with yourself, then you can build healthier and positive relationships with other people and the world around you. But if the foundation is cracked or weak, then you're going to be in a world of hurt.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this reminds me, I was actually just speaking to a client today about this because the biggest focus of our sessions together is relationship with self. And I asked this person, what do you think of when you think of relationship to self? And the way that they phrased it was, it's my relationship to my thoughts. And I found that incredibly fascinating. And I don't even think I've really engaged in the fact that there's also a relationship with thoughts as well. I'm more about the managing of thoughts, the corralling of thoughts, and sometimes controlling or repressing, like all of the things we do with thoughts. But to have a relationship with them spoke to me in that specific way. And that I think a lot of our relationship to self is our relationship to our own thoughts, because they dictate so much about what we do, how we feel, how we operate in a day. So improving that improves your relationship to self almost. And it's almost could be viewed as a foundational piece of your own tower that you're building that needs to be at the bottom for everything else to be built off of. Otherwise, self-deprecation and unhealthy verbiage and disrespect come through, and the whole thing topples down, right? So
Absolutely.
I just found it very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll piggyback on that. I think the focus then needs to become, if we're truly talking about the relationship with our thoughts, is around the thoughts that we avoid or that give us the most anxiety. And that's where the answers lie in my mind, because once we start exploring those thoughts, we learn a lot about ourselves and our history and our wounding and all of it.
Absolutely. Amen. And, I'm actually going to double piggyback, because I think there's a really cool concept in there as well. Something that I've personally struggled with is my inability to allow in the joyful thoughts. On the same side, it's blocking the joyful thoughts that come in, which means I don't have a great relationship with joy. That's the obvious of the equation, but it's what is my relationship to those thoughts? Because I'm pushing those away too, saying that couldn't be possible. You didn't do enough. There could be more, or you're not deserving of it. Like all of these experiences as well. So it's on both sides, where I have personally learned so much about my relationship to self and what I feel willing to feel and not feel, or think and not think.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. And often, yeah, I think the result of that, I guess, in real tough relationship we can have with joy is guilt, right? And then we carry that guilt for some reason. Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, I think you've talked about why you got into this aspect of coaching around relationships through your own experience. What was it kind of like? What were the answers that you came up with? Like, what were those? You mentioned joy is one of them, but what were you hiding from? Why were you chasing relationships? And what's changed now that you've had more awareness?
Good question. Incredible question. And I think a question that will speak to a lot of people listening is, why are we chasing relationships? And there's so many facets to that I've learned about myself, and I've learned just in general, and I'm sure you'll be able to speak to this in depth as well. But for me, I have anxious attachment style tendencies. So that's a huge one for me. Now, notice, for those listening, I didn't say I have an anxious attachment style. I'm not identifying with this. It is just patterns of behavior that I've repeated that have kept me safe. So detaching from that was first step of recognizing, okay, you are an anxious attachment style. That is your behavior. That is who you are. And that still didn't really support my journey. So I still had to find a way to separate that, which is obviously further steps along. So I have an anxious attachment style behavior pattern. I also have a physical touch as my number one love language. So you combine those two and you start to come across pretty aggressive in the ways in which you're operating, right? You want to be held hands and touchy and feely, right? That's my number one. And at the same time, you're anxious about this person leaving you. So now you're actually physically embodying that. Right. And then to extend off of that, the challenge that I feel like I swear all of us have is I don't want to say a problem, but I guess the challenge is that there's a lot of enmeshed family systems. So you start to believe that partner should be the person that you want them to be, and that you should be molding into one, not keeping yourself separate into two.
Right.
And so combine all of those things. And there I was, just over and over and over again, refusing to be alone, refusing to be single, only leaving a relationship if I knew another one was right there. It was this constant pull because I couldn't be alone. I couldn't be with myself because I didn't know what that meant. And at the same time, I was mimicking behaviors that my family behaved in the sense of there was new people in my life often. And what that translated to me as was, oh, okay, got it. They can come and go. There's not really a commitment level here. You commit fully when you're in it, but you can go whenever. And so you can just kind of, this is going to sound terrible, but you can almost recycle. You can just move through the process, because as long as you're with somebody, you're fine. That's the goal. Just be with somebody at some point. So that left me chasing, again, like I said, every relationship that I was in until I finally took a stand.
Yeah. And I think everything you've explained, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but dating apps don't really help either, right? Because it's made relationships and I don't know if this would be controversial, but it's made relationships very disposable. And I think if you've got certain tendencies where, or beliefs that you may have carried from childhood that, hey, it's okay to recycle. Now everything that we have in society has made it easier to do that. So anyways, that's probably a conversation for another day, but
fair. And, controversial, but I like where you're headed with that. And I think there's a lot of legs to that because it gives context to the disposability that we're speaking of, right? And it gives context to the on-demandness that we've created with a relationship. And that is so far from how foundationally speaking relationships are built. They're not necessarily on demand. And so a lot of times, although they're beautiful in their own way, and I'm not knocking anybody who's ever created a beautiful relationship out of it, I do think with the right intention, they work 100%.
Yeah.
But the variable is the intention of, sure. Am I looking to build something sustainable, strong, meaningful with a great foundation, or am I lonely?
Yeah. And I think in that point you've made, I think there's an aspect of also having some resiliency and showing up, right? I think we often get caught up in, we have obviously our own biases and our blind spots, even when it comes to relationships. We view it as, oh, I'm doing everything here, and the other person needs to pull their weight. And meanwhile, they're thinking the same, and we're not communicating. And we have obviously our egos show up, and obviously they cause denial, and we kind of start distorting reality. And that creates an issue too. And I think it's really about coming in with the intention of showing up as your best self, not worrying about the outcomes or what the other person's doing, which obviously is very hard.
Absolutely. And something that we're going to discuss, I already know, is that concept of best self, I think for me really means authentic self. It's the truest version of you. And sometimes that's not the best possible version of you, because that's the facade. It's really the authenticity of, you had a bad day today and you still show up from that place of not suppressing that. And that is your best, right? That showing up still, even though it's been a hard day, that is the best that you can offer in that moment. But that's the real. And that's the true authenticity of that experience.
Absolutely. And in those moments, it's also being humble and asking for compassion and demonstrating it. And one of the concepts I like, I believe it's from the Gottmans, is the emotional bank account, right? It's building that emotional bank account where you can withdraw from.
Amen. Well said.
Yeah. So I think we talked about, and I identify, or I have also tendencies as an anxious attached person. And I think there's a constant need to be in a relationship too, because we struggle to be alone. So thank you for sharing that. And now that, we kind of talked about insecurities, that kind of feeds into how, I believe we were talking offline about it, how insecurities present themselves in relationships, and without either, first of all, having awareness ourselves, but even if you have the awareness, communicating that to your partner. I truly believe you need to have those conversations. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think it's a prerequisite to the foundation. And that's the foundation that I support my clients with the most, is that it doesn't matter at what stage you're in. If the foundation is not built on the level of communication that allows for the hard things to be said, then over the long term, that will be something that will dissolve the trust in the relationship. It will dissolve the trust you feel towards yourself and the trust you feel towards them, because there's always something hidden. There's always something beneath, and you don't know what that is. And that can also translate as a lack of consideration. Can translate as, I don't consider you in the space. Because I don't consider myself.
And it can lead to resentment.
Exactly. And resentment will then show in forms of shortness, disrespect, lack of communication, avoidance. The list is endless. Resentment is a festering mold inside the system that will break it apart, will create a brutal stench, and make it really difficult to be around that person. because of that resentment, I guess, stench we could call it, that impacts the air quality, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's like, the skeletons in the closet, they just keep getting worse. So I guess if I mean, when I was younger, I would have struggled to talk about my insecurities with my partner because I would have been worried about how she would view me. And I would be worried about coming across as weak. And I think there's a certain level of confidence that comes with maturity and when you do that work. But I think that could be a struggle for many men or women, but especially men, I would think, especially when it comes to discussing our insecurities. That's where we really struggle. So what are some things that you talk about with clients, or at least in your model or framework that you've built? How can people navigate that?
Yeah, insecurities are for sure one of the biggest factors in just life in general. Right? The idea that we don't feel secure in a certain area really impacts the way we operate, and it creates things like comparisonitis. We're constantly comparing to other spaces, and that in and of itself then compares to the relationships, and then it compares to the family systems, and it goes on and on. And I think, what I've noticed with myself and the people that I speak to is that insecurities are often not given any room because they don't want to make them real. I think a lot of times we think insecurities are just in our own head, and that's where they live. And I would say most of the time that's true. However, when there's a physical manifestation of that, let's say I don't feel secure in any part of my body, right? That can feel like it's a physical manifestation of this idea that you have about yourself. Yeah, I think that insecurities are going to be the thing that we take the longest to kind of adjust to and navigate. And in relationships, they're incredibly difficult because it requires that new level of honesty. Like, you can be honest with yourself all day long, but to be honest with somebody else about that experience then creates this focus on you. And I think a lot of times we get into relationships focused on our partner because it takes away from the fact that we don't have to focus on ourselves anymore. We don't have to be with ourselves. We have somebody else to be with. And addressing an insecurity you have about yourself then puts the focus on you and requires you to face that part of you, requires you to face yourself. And I believe that's one of the hardest things we do on this human planet is face ourselves, because in the process of coming face to face with yourself through the mirroring process of every relationship you're ever in, we are then asked to do something about it. And I think a lot of us, at least from my experience, we don't want to actually do something about it. We almost like the fact that there is something wrong because eventually we could fix it. So if it wasn't wrong, then what would we do? So we're so used to this like concept of I always have something to do. I have something to focus on, because then I don't actually have to, in a way, embrace the power I have on this planet to take on the big things, to expand myself, to really, really do something with this human experience, to really live. So if I can sit in my pool of insecurity, then I can just be okay. I'm good there. I'm safe there. That's where my safety is.
Yeah.
And it's complex in every single person, right? And each insecurity is different, right? Like for us, for example, an insecurity, I don't know if you felt it around it, so maybe I won't generalize, but around the anxious attachment tendencies, I don't want to admit that, because what would people then think of me if I actually owned that?
Yeah.
Which I think, now that I'm processing this out loud with you, speaks to the idea that we don't speak about our insecurities because even we don't believe they're real. But then we speak about them and then they're real. So we don't want to make them real, but we just like the idea that they could be real so we can stay in protection mode. And reduce the possibility of intense connection. So that really just kind of came to me in the sense of it's all really just for safety. It's all just to keep ourselves safe and know that we can sit in the same feeling we've been in because it just feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, comfort, right? It's all about comfort. And I think it does take a great level of awareness to even accept your own securities. Like, I'm not going to say I have that level of awareness, but for me, it brought up a lot of issues from childhood around the need for validation, the need for approval, and seeking that from partners. And how do you even first of all, if, like I said, if you have that awareness, how do you communicate that to your partner? Saying, hey, I need constant validation from you. Like it really fires up my anxious attachment style when I don't get this validation. Like, how do you say that without coming across as needy? And as men, we don't want to seem needy. So I think, I mean, I'm also saying, yeah, you can express it that way, but that's also not right. It's not healthy. But it's something that I believe you need to be able to express to your partner, saying, hey, this is something I struggle with, just so you know. So when I'm acting out or I'm acting hurt or whatever it's going on, potentially where the source is, right? And so, but we obviously don't have those conversations. And I was gonna go, my next question would have been like, when is the right time to have those conversations? Because I believe once we pass that honeymoon phase where we've shown our best self, now we've created this facade, as you said, and now we have to, keep the act going. Fake it till you make it is, what a lot of people say. So when is the right time? I believe it's very early in the relationship, but what are your thoughts?
Well, define really early first.
I think it's once you've gotten to the point of the understanding that, hey, we're going to start dating. Then it's like, okay, well, here's a side of me that you should know about. And now it's your decision. I'm giving you the option here to decide if you want to be in a relationship with me or not, and vice versa. What happens is we take that control away from someone by hiding it and not talking about it and waiting for the right time, or pushing it out too long, where it's like, now it's like, well, I can't have this conversation now. So that's how I feel about it, at least.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. I think in a lot of ways I agree, for sure. And the communication side of it is, it's going to get old, and it's already old. People are like, just communicate. And everyone's like, I know. And then nothing changes because they're like, I am communicating. And it's so fascinating to me. And honestly, I almost find myself becoming irritated by myself. And my coaching experiences of like, listen, we got to communicate more. And they're like, I am. And I'm like, you're really not, though.
but communication also is very subjective, like the word itself, right? Words have many meanings. And when we say communicate, I believe people often think, oh, just talking to your partner, right? There's different levels of communication and depth to it, right? And I think we're talking about like the real deep stuff.
Yeah, the hard things, the things that no one ever wants to share, because it means that you will then be fully seen, and that's scary, right?
Yes.
Being seen is scary. So what we all crave, and this is so scary. But as far as timeline goes, I think that it has to be a part of the foundation that you say the hard things. So whatever it is that the hard thing is, the sooner the better, for sure. But I would challenge the narrative that you need to walk into your interview style dating experience and start to ask them, what's your attachment style and how do you cope with this and what are your coping patterns and all. I would challenge that narrative, because in that sense, then we're seeking them to be a specific type of person in order for us to accept them into our lives. And that's not always the case. And it blocks the real potential that space could have, because we think that there's a specific compatibility component that we'll find within that information, which is not a great narrative, because then it does block you from finding that partner. And I would argue that a lot of people are looking for a partner and can't find one because of the metrics they've placed on the person they're looking for. And there is no wiggle room. There is no opportunity for them to be human. They just need to have these things figured out. So in that context, do I think that if it's prompted to you as to answer the question of, what is your attachment style and how do you go about handling that, or any of really your insecurities, I think that being honest in the sense of, I haven't really looked at it yet, or, that's an interesting question. Like, what do you mean by that? And that's just the staying open process. Where the power comes in is what we spoke about earlier, which is the relationship to self. If you haven't had these conversations with yourself, you're not going to have them with your partner. Right. So if I have an anxious attachment style and I'm not processing that on my own, in my own head, on my own paper, I'm not processing it with her, because it's more triggering to do with her, because then it admits that I am not perfect. And that threatens the relationship.
Right.
Or at least it feels like it does. So I would never do that. I don't want to be single. So I'm going to do my best to have this conversation with you. But like I said, it won't necessarily always go over well. And I would say the majority of the time it won't if you're not talking to yourself about this. And, maybe that's not the case. Talk to a best friend.
Yeah.
I think a lot of ways there's other resources that we have. Talk to a friend, talk to a perfectly random stranger. And that, I think to some might sound scary, but I actually find that sometimes even easier because they have no context of who you are and you could never see them again. So there's outlets. And I think that having that conversation almost building up into okay, I'm ready to tell my partner kind of idea could be a gateway for a lot of people because it's difficult to have that and to admit that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great point. And I think if you've had that conversation with yourself, you're also giving yourself that time and space to accept it and become comfortable with it. Because I mean, you start reading some of the qualities, right? Whether you're avoidant or anxiously attached, I think you start reading some of the qualities, and there's some tough ones, right? They're not easy to swallow. And often, to your point, if you're having those conversations with your partner, it may seem as this person may be looking down on you, or it's, oh, maybe I am a failure, or I'm not good enough. There's a lot of narratives that can come up when you're trying to discuss that with your partner, or go through that assessment with them. But yeah, I think when you do it with yourself first, you've given yourself enough time to accept it and become comfortable with it, and understand that it's perfectly normal to have these attachment styles or insecurities. To your point, we all have them in different capacities and to different extremes, but yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And the insecurity side of this conversation is really where I think a lot of the trust is built in the relationship, because you're handing over a piece of you that you've never handed over to anyone before. So the trust that's built out of that is profound. And this is why saying the hard things is so important, is because every time we don't, we are actively avoiding connection. We are actively avoiding the connection that we could have with our partner by saying, I'm withholding this information from you. Now, there's a lot of people that I've spoken to that said, well, isn't that oversharing? Like, shouldn't you keep some things to yourself? And I absolutely hear you. And I am going to challenge that narrative, because there's a concept called microscopic truths that I practice with my partner. It's in a book called Conscious Loving. And they speak about the importance of not necessarily feeling the need to share every single thought you have. However, be conscious of the thoughts or narratives or stories you're not sharing that are blocking connection. So if I'm having a thought of I am irritated in the morning, okay, and I can move through it. I got this. It's all good. I'm a man, so I got this, right? The narrative we love. And so I'm trying to move on. But over the course of the day, I'm still struggling with this narrative, right? I'm still in this thought of I'm irritated, and I maybe haven't invested my time into understanding why. At some point, and honestly, probably right out of the gate, if you live with this person, that will affect the way in which you're operating with your partner. Right. And that seems obvious, right? Yeah. But not admitting that you're irritated, which is the microscopic truth, is what is blocking your ability to connect with your partner. And we think it's no big deal, right? We think it's, well, this shouldn't be an opportunity to connect, but it is, because to some degree it's conflict. And every single time conflict is a gateway to connection. Every single time, including the conflict you have within yourself. Do I need to say this or do I not? That's the gateway to connection every single time. Yeah. And then it gives you the opportunity to be like, okay, yeah, I'm feeling irritated right now. And they're like, oh, okay, interesting. Like, is everything okay? And you're like, yeah, I don't really, feel like talking about it. I just wanted to share with you. And that could be the end. But all of a sudden, what you don't expect that happens in that moment is now you're trying to figure out, oh, why am I irritated? Interesting. Well, she asked me that question and I feel like I rejected it, which is my boundary, but I am very curious now. Why am I irritated? What's the reason here? And all of a sudden you connect to yourself deeper. Conflict being a gateway to connection every single time.
Do you feel that if you just leave it at that, saying, hey, and I'm putting myself on the receiving end as an anxiously attached person, if you're dropping that on your partner saying, hey, I'm irritated, but that's all I know, could that not make especially if the other person has an anxious attachment style, feel nervous. It's like, oh, what's going to happen here? Is this person looking to break up with me, or like a million thoughts would come to your head.
100%.
So what do you do in those situations, especially when it comes to communication?
Well, what I found is that 99.99% of the time, if someone's willing and courageous enough to share that they're irritated, they're willing to share more. They just haven't faced that truth yet. They're very like, okay, well, I'm just going to do this because I got to do this. And then they get it out. And then all of a sudden there's a sense of overwhelming freedom they don't realize clicks in when they admit to having an experience like that. And at least for me, as a man in my experience with a woman, the ability to zoom out my experience is profound, right? Men, we all know it. We're tunnel vision as hell. We love a good one direction, and that's the only way we're going. And I can't see any other solutions around that way. So if I'm irritated, all I see is get rid of the irritation. And I just had a conversation with my partner about this exact concept where she brought up the idea of, what if you just were with the headache? What if you were just with the irritation and it didn't require it to be a problem? Like, what if it wasn't a problem? And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, I was instantly challenging because all I can think about is what's the reason and how to get rid of it. Right. But the freedom that comes from admitting and owning that I'm irritated is often enough to push me into another space, because it says I'm willing to hear what you have to say, even though I don't quite know that yet. Right. It's the realization in the process. But at least the result is complete. Okay, I said it. Done. And then the feminine oracle comes in and she's like, okay, let's talk about it. Let's process this. And you're like, no, I completed this task. It's over.
Exactly. Well, she sounds like she's dropping some stoicism on you. What if it's not a problem?
And sometimes that's right. And what she didn't say was, get rid of it, or I pretend like it's not there. It's just, are we making a problem out of it? Because it can still exist without being a problem. And I'm still wrapping my head around this, to be honest with you. So I'm not beyond this by any means. And even as I speak about all these communication tools and practices and microscopic truths, I still don't always say them. I still find myself keeping them in. I still find myself blocking connection and removing myself from conflict, or reducing the possibility of conflict. And I think that's just a beautiful journey. Is just a drifting and then a returning, drift and then a return. And that is something we have to be okay with.
Absolutely. We're all a work in progress, right? Like, if Will Smith can have a moment last night, we all, are works in progress. I guess, so based on the level of communication you're talking about, there needs to be a level of understanding too, right? On both ends, that, hey, we are going to be comfortable having these conversations. Like, I should be able to express myself and say, hey, I'm irritated, and vice versa, right? And without either person taking it personally.
Right. In a safe space. And I think I understand where you're going with that, because what I know to be true is a lot of times there are one-way agreements made in relationship, in that I'm doing the work. So therefore I will share all of these things with you. And my basic expectation now, because I'm doing the work, is that you will then also do the exact same thing. We all know that doesn't work. And that gets us into trouble in every single relationship that we get into. It's the expectation side of things, but that's for another conversation. I think that if these practices are going to be in place, I know that it has to be a mutual agreement, or it will not work every single time. So how do we go about that? How do we do that? We have a meeting of the minds, the bringing together of you and your partner to have a conversation about what it is that you are looking for from the relationship. And this might seem like, well, I don't know, we know what we want. And I would argue that you don't. I really don't think you do, because you haven't had the conversation. You haven't broken it down into, this is what I expect out of this relationship. This is what I hope for. How do we collaborate to find a beautiful middle that we both agree to? So this is where these communication tools come into place. These are what is called relationship agreements. So you come together just like a business plan. Literally, I'm not even kidding you. You open up the notes in your phone
Yeah.
And you start to write down the things that you are mutually agreeing to do in the relationship. This is not roles. This is not dishes. This is not who cleans the house. Although it still could be. What this is really getting at is the nitty gritty of, okay, we agree to not yell at each other in conflict. That is an agreement I am making with you in this process. So if I break that agreement, then there's something that we need to face and address. But I'm agreeing to do my best to regulate myself and not yell during conversation. Why? Because it is disrespectful and does not get us a heightened conflict, right? One that I made with my partner a long time ago is, in conflict, we will not be swearing at each other. That is a pattern I've seen. That is a pattern she's seen. Both patterns we've both created in our whole lives. We will not be doing that. Can we agree on that? And as long as they agree to this term, in a sense of the relationship, then we can move forward and know that when we handle conflict, we're both actively working on trying to navigate this experience. And if these agreements aren't made at some point, hopefully early on in the relationship, then you will run into problems because there is an expectation someone's doing the work that they actually haven't agreed to do. You just think it's a basic component of a relationship when really it's not for them. For them, it is yelling. For them, it is swearing. That's a basic component. And you're saying that's wrong. And that's the problem. You have completely different ideas on how to navigate this. So what is your agreement? And that is how I think you really start to get into the nitty gritty of microscopic truths and heightened communication.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think those agreements are really important. I guess there's one of the areas I would like to explore in the agreement space then is, how do you handle if, say, your partner breaks the agreement? And quite often it could become a tit for tat, especially if you're both elevated or the emotions are high. So how do you manage that? Like, and I'm just thinking out loud, like, I think if you need to keep the bigger picture in mind and not really focus on what may have happened with your partner, the fact that they broke their side of the agreement. So what do you do in those moments? Like,
yeah, and that's a common narrative, right? In the sense that there's one-sided work being done and it's not equal. And what do I do? And they won't change. And all of these concepts that we all have probably experienced at some point or another. And I think what I know to be true is that becomes a thing because of the lack of agreements made. And that it's just as simple as that. And that might be like, yeah, well, no, we talked about it. And I'm like, but you didn't agree on it. Someone self-sacrificed in that process. Someone abandoned their truth, and it's showing because they're not committing to this agreement. They're committing to it because they're fearful of the relationship being threatened. They didn't actually want to agree to it. So the conversation wasn't actually had. It was just, hey, I need you to start doing this. And they're like, yeah, okay, got you. It's not an agreement. It's an ultimatum. Relationships can't operate on ultimatums. They have to be mutually agreed upon circumstances. A really basic example of an agreement that my partner and I have is how we operate in the morning. One of the challenges was that we would wake up and not sure what the other person was doing or would want to do. So there was a sense of codependency and enmeshment. And, we should expect the other person to want to connect with us and be with us in the morning coffee. A multitude of different experiences that exist in that space. We also wanted to prioritize connection. So this is the first steps we did was, okay, what works best for you in the morning and what works best for me in the morning? Not what are we going to agree upon? It's what works for you and what works for me. That is the conversation that I'm talking about when you have agreements, is what works for you and what works for me. What do you want and what do I want? Not what do I want from you, right? What do I want from a relationship that I want to be a part of? And that is your needs, your wants, and your desires. Now, at the end of it all, we know that this is a hard part of ourselves to own and actually be responsible for. So I know that there's work to be done already in there, but expressing these gives us the opportunity for the microscopic truth of your needs, wants, and desires to actually be presented so that you can then collaborate on what it is that you're looking for. If I walk in and say there is absolutely no swearing in relationships, that's my need, want, and desire, and my partner says, I have a tendency to do that, that's a different kind of conversation. What she's not saying is, and this is not the actual facts of the situation, but just an example, what she's not saying is, I really want to. What she's saying is, I might struggle with that. And I'm hoping that if that's something that you really value, that I can do my best to support, but I cannot guarantee it because it's something I'm really going to have to work hard at. And I have to be okay with that. Why? Because I don't own them. I don't own the relationship. I don't own my partner. I own myself.
Right.
So all I have the ability to do is control how I respond in those moments. We all know that, right?
Yeah. And I guess that's where I was going with that question is, so how do you respond? Right. And I mean, the general you, I think it's, if your partner is being honest with you saying, hey, this is a tendency potentially, then if you're willing to accept it, then you accept it, right? And it's having that level of compassion and empathy for your partner too. Don't use that as an opportunity then to guilt them or shame them, saying, hey, we had this conversation, you keep doing it, but you've accepted it. So, I think a lot of times what happens is you kind of hold that over your partner's head and as guilt or whatever you want to call it.
More resentment. More resentment and more dissolvement of trust. I no longer trust that you'll be able to handle this conversation with me. So I'm going to stop having conversations with you because you won't change this behavior, rather than addressing it in each individual moment to moment basis and not letting it be the dictator of your entire relationship. If that succumbs in that moment and there's swearing involved because against what we agreed upon, then I have the ability to take myself out of that space and say, hey, listen, I think we're getting heated here. I'm going to go take a few minutes and I'll be right back. And then you come back, and in that process, they have already realized what they've done. You didn't have to belittle or disrespect or antagonize them for it. It is a process for them. And you essentially lead by example, because then you open up the opportunity for them to notice when they're swearing and then say, whoa, I actually think I need to take a minute here. I'll be right back. They calm themselves down. This is the concept of you can only really change yourself in a relationship. You can never actually change your partner. You can only lead by example. And if they follow, they follow. And if they don't, they don't. And over time, you have to decipher what you will accept as part of being in a relationship and what you won't.
Right. Yeah, no, that's fair. One of the questions I did want to ask, and I know we're getting close on time, but we talked about earlier sharing our insecurities, right? And the reason why we struggle with that is, I mean, there's many reasons. One of them I wanted to explore is our ability to trust someone else, because maybe we've been burnt in the past. Maybe we're worried of how they'll think about us, whether they're going to judge us or not. But there's that level of trust. Now, on the receiving end, if you're getting that information from your partner, how do you handle it where you're able to maintain that trust?
Getting what information?
Like if your partner, you have those conversations around your insecurities, and your partner sharing that information with you that, hey, these are my insecurities. On the receiving end, how do you maintain that trust?
Yeah. And this is an incredibly fascinating part of, I think, including my relationship, every relationship, is the removal of your own judgment of that experience. And, this is coming from a space that I know we all do struggle with, even if we don't want to admit it, is someone shares something with us. And by nature, we are judging them based on their ability or inability to handle it or to move through it, or the fact that they're even feeling that way in the first place. And
it could differ based on values too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. 100%. And so really where I think how do you handle it on the receiving end? It's love. And what I mean by that is it's loving them regardless, which is cliche to say, but what is more important in that process as a reminder when you say, I'm going to love them regardless, is to love yourself regardless. So on the receiving end, what is really happening when they share that and you're feeling judged or feeling judgmental or triggered or whatever, because the whole time you're judging yourself, you're feeling triggered by your own insecurity, not theirs. They're just simply mirroring back to you how you feel about your own. And so what do we do on the receiving end? Well, we tend to gaslight. We tend to be less considerate towards theirs because we're less considerate to our own. And we gaslight them because we gaslight ourselves. So how do we move through that? We do the work on our own every single day to learn how to stop gaslighting ourselves. So we stop gaslighting our partner.
Yeah.
We learn how to validate our own insecurities so we can validate theirs, but we won't be able to validate theirs if we don't validate our own, not truthfully anyway. So how do we contain that conversation? Really simply is being honest. and being honest with how you're feeling in that moment. And that, I think, goes a long way, because it would really suck if I was sharing my insecurity with someone and little be announced to me in their head, they're like, are you going to be okay? Like, what the hell? Or are you something wrong with you, or XYZ? Like, they're in this very unsafe space that I don't know and I'm perceiving as safe. I would rather know that it's unsafe and that we can continue this conversation at a different time than continue to walk myself on a thread of wire that could snap at any moment.
Yeah.
So noticing your own nervous system deregulation and just being honest and be like, oh, whoa, this has nothing to do with you. I'm feeling really some type of way with this. And it's very weird. And I know it sounds weird because you shared your insecurity with me, but it's mirroring back to me something. And I don't really know what that is. So I apologize. I'm sorry for that. I know that you wanted a safe space here. And I'll do my best to handle it better next time. And that's high level communication, right? Like, that's really a heightened level of self-awareness. I think it's at the very basis is just there's a concept that's in the book called Getting to Zero by Jason Gaddies, and he calls it LUFU, and LUFU, and it stands for listen until fully understood. And reminding ourselves of LUFU, I guess, would be the most basic way to operate that conversation. Is you're triggered. You're feeling some type of way, maybe slightly insecure because they're sharing a similar insecurity. And if you say LUFU in your head, then you say to yourself, listen until you fully understand. And that requires you to be curious and ask questions and actually engage with them. And that will slowly remove your own self insecurity triggers that are rising in that moment and allow you to be a little bit more of a safe space.
Absolutely.
Which takes practice, and it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's not as simple as I make it out to be, but the more the practice, right, the more the progress.
I think biggest piece is being aware of it too, right? And that can help tremendously. And I guess if you're not able to handle that level of truth, whether it's your own judgments kicking in or your insecurities, to your point, being honest, but also being honest about, hey, this is not something I can handle. And not giving that kind of deception to the other person, and just being aware of that too, I think is important. But to your point, the biggest thing is working through it if you truly care for this person.
100%. Yeah. It's like, what's the most loving way I can respond to this right now? Where can I bring in the most love into this equation? And if that's love to your own fear of what this is bringing up, then that's what it is. It's loving the fear as well. Right. So yeah, I think that question will live with me as long as I go through anything is, where can I bring love to this? Because then it automatically calms my nervous system, because it's almost as if just saying the word love allows me to step into it.
Yeah, for sure. No, this has been great, Kyle. I mean, I feel like we can talk for longer than this, but unfortunately we have to come to an end. But thank you again for doing this. For listeners that want to find out more about your course or yourself, what are some ways they can do that? How can they find you, whether it's online, social media? Yeah, please share.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you again for having me, because this is what I love to talk about. And like I said at the beginning, this is what I realize livens me. So even just in this moment now, I'm ready to just keep talking. Let's just keep diving in. Yeah. But if you want to know more information about me, yes, I am on social medias as the relationship coach _. So that's how you can find me. And I have an online course called Relationships 101 that dives deep into what I believe to be some of the most important concepts to understand, either whether you're in or getting into a relationship: attachment styles, love languages, codependency, the upper limits problem, masculine, feminine energy. It's all in there, 8 full masterclasses. So you can find that at coachkylerushton.com. And then you can also work with me. I provide one-on-one coaching for people who are ideally in relationships, those who are recovering, and those who are looking to enter in. I also support couples as well in bridging their own gaps of fear into love as a couple. So I'm here to support in all areas. So you can find me there.
Cool. Well, that's great. Thanks again. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. As always, please subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy the episodes, or leave a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. Thank you again, and until next week.